all for joining us, and I want to take a really short time to welcome Dr. Robert Biswas Diener. He's going to be opening us up, especially into some of the narrative sides of the field. He's also an international traveler, so he'll be able to give us a wide perspective to the kinds of topics we've been looking at and weave it together. Thank you, Dr. Diener.
In about 5 seconds, I'm going to tell you a story with a surprise ending. Are you ready? June 1st, 2009, my phone rang. I know by the picture it looks like it was 1979, but no, it was 2009. My phone rang, and it was a prospective client inquiring about coaching services. And like many of the clients who walk in my business's virtual front door, he had a problem. And his problem was related to work. So let me tell you a tiny bit about Adam. Adam works within the computer industry, broadly, and lives in San Francisco. He had relocated from the Midwest, the American Midwest, made a big move, had experienced some social upheaval that comes with moves, liked the Bay Area plenty well enough. He thought it was a vibrant and dynamic place. He had been married for 2 or 3 years. Things seemed to be going pretty well in most domains of his life except work, which is why he called me. I said, "Tell me what's going wrong at work." He said, "I am at the end of my rope. I cannot take it another day." I said, "Wow, well, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about your work." He said, "Absolutely not. Here's what I want to do. I want to send you a picture of my work. I want to send you a photograph of my work, because this literally will be worth 1,000 words. This photo encapsulates everything you need to know about my workplace." Yeah. Now imagine you had to work there. He said, "It is terrible. This is not exactly a green space." He said, "The physical, architectural, and decorative environment of this office place is symbolic of virtually every aspect of the organization, from the management on down to my daily commute. It is all embodied in this image." Adam had a flair for metaphor, which I quite like in a client. And he said, "It is like working in the mines. It's like going to the mines every day. It is like I am shut off in the blackness where I can no longer see the sun." Imagine that. Imagine if that's what you had to report about work at the end of the day. It felt like I was shut out from the sun. So I agreed to work with him because I felt very badly for him. And I hoped in some small way that I might facilitate some positive change in his life. And we began working together, meeting weekly, until one day he was a no-show. And that's pretty rare for clients. I don't know how many of you coach, but these are pretty high-functioning, pretty successful people. They tend not to just break appointments and not show up. And I was concerned. Where was he? Seemed unlike him. He'd always been good about making appointments before. And a few days later, I got an email from him, sent from the hospital, where Adam, at age 45, had had a heart attack. A heart attack at age 45. He said, "I told you I could not take it anymore. This is my body's way of hammering that point home. I cannot imagine it getting much worse than this." And he apologized for missing the appointment, but of course I told him I understood and expressed sympathy for him. And I followed up 2 weeks later. I wanted to give him, some time to recuperate, to get home. And I followed up 2 weeks later just to kind of see if he needed anything from me. I didn't want to push him into resuming work with me, but, I, I, but, 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 And so I phoned him, and he said, you know where I was today? Where? I was at work. 2 weeks after his heart attack, he was back at work in the same office. And he loved it. Let me say that again. He loved it. Had he gone crazy? He loved it. He said, I realized that I'm the star of this story. I realized that I am a tough person. I realized that I am resilient, hardy, if you will. I realized that really this isn't a story about me complaining about my office. That's a pretty easy story to tell. This is a story about what I can do, how I can be an agent in my own life, how I can make the best of a bad situation, or maybe even do a little better than that, how I can make better of a bad situation, maybe even truly flourish, find the sort of the hidden nuggets that I've been overlooking. And I think it's wonderful because we actually quit working together at that point because in some ways he didn't need me, and I love it when clients sort of heal themselves and I don't have to do anything because I'm lazy. But he really stood out to me, and I had to ask myself, what was it that allowed Adam this epiphany? He had this dramatic life event that created a reflective space for him that is much like the space that you might create as a consultant or a coach or a therapist or sometimes even an educator. And it's exactly what we want for people. These brilliant moments, these places of peace or solitude or withdrawn from their context in such a way that allows them to sort of take stock of everything and make the change that will be best for them. And I loved that he, with his flair for the dramatic and for the narrative and for metaphor, that he explicitly said that this was about a story. I loved the idea that he said, I was just focused, my story was about work. And I realized my story isn't about work, my story's about me. I'm the protagonist. I'm the star of the story. And once I started looking at me, and it took a heart attack to allow that to happen, but once I started looking at me, it was a fundamental and profound shift in my perspective that was so entirely different than just looking at what my boss was doing wrong, about the unreasonable deadlines, about the horrible cubicles. I absolutely loved it. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Adam was getting across, which is that you all, not we are, you all in this room are natural storytellers. You tell stories all the time. When you get together at the holidays, you share family lore. You tell the same funny stories, embarrassing stories. You remember the time when you come home from work, you chat up your spouse, your friend, whoever, and you say, oh, you'll never believe what happened to me today. What a great opening to a story. You'll never believe it, right? You're actually artful storytellers. But being the author of those narratives is entirely up to you. So what's going to happen today is several sort of concurrent talks all at once. One is I'm going to give you a few practical pieces of information, both about positive psychology that will serve as the foundation upon which to rest your storytelling, but specifically about how to tell a story. What I'm also going to do is simply just tell a lot of stories. And I hope you'll forgive me for doing so. My reason for telling the stories is that I am far more concerned with how a story is told than with what the story is. And I believe that everyone can really essentially improve in their ability to convey information to others. So I want you to evaluate me as a storyteller, as a presenter. I haven't looked at my slides yet. I think that's kind of a neat, practical point for a presenter to do. I'm sorry to stand up here and kind of brag in front of you about that, but I just want to point it out that's a storytelling technique, that I'm delivering something to you here, and I'm doing so intentionally. Everyone with me? Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about stories at work. Some of you may know this research, but Amy Wisniewski has studied people's relationship to their own work, and she calls this work orientation. And she divides people roughly into three categories: people who are in a job, a career, or a calling. She doesn't use the term, but I think about that largely as people having a story about their job, right? A story about what they do from 9 to 5 every day. And that story includes all the things that you would find in the best novels or the most thrilling blockbuster movies. Things like motive. People in a job orientation are motivated by money. People in a career orientation are motivated by a sense of advancement, increased supervisory responsibility, higher status, more vacation time. People in a calling orientation, by contrast, are interested in creating a world that is better than the one that they have walked into. They are motivated primarily by a sense of the deep, meaningful impact of what they do. People in a job orientation don't necessarily like their job. They look forward to going on break. They look forward to getting off at the end of the day. People in a career orientation, they may or may not like their job. They may or may not recommend it to a friend. They sometimes like the daily tasks, but they look forward to going on vacation, for example. And people in a calling orientation, they look forward to work. They love it because they believe what they do is valuable. They're not workaholics, though. I want to make that distinction clear. These are not workaholics. These are people who just believe in the meaningfulness of their own work. So imagine this story. Imagine young researcher Amy Wisniewski going down to Texas to collect data from people in a hospital, and she wants to interview everybody to find out who's in a job, who's in a career, and who's in a calling, because her earlier research suggests that it is not occupation dependent. You can have bus drivers who feel like they're in a calling. You could have medical doctors who feel like they're in a job. It is not occupation dependent. So she goes down to Texas. She interviews everyone, the people that work in the gift shop, the security guards, the janitorial staff, the nursing staff, the financial staff, the record-keeping staff, the people that work at the information booth, absolutely everybody in the hospital. Now imagine this. Imagine an interview with a nurse who works in the long-term chronic care ward, a ward not unlike this one. And the nurse saying the following. I went in one day to do my rounds, and you know, people here are in a chronic vegetative state. Nothing much ever happens in this particular ward. Nothing changes. And my rounds are pretty simple. You know, I check people's vital signs. I take notation, jot down, small notes on their charts. But on one particular day, I went into the ward, and there was just something different about it, which I put out of my mind instantly because, of course, in this place, among all the other places in the hospital, this place, nothing ever changes. This place is stable day in, day out. But still, as I went about my rounds, there was something just kind of itching at my consciousness, demanding my attention. And finally, I put my finger on it. I knew exactly what it was. The paintings that were on the north wall were gone. And now they were on the south wall. And the paintings that were on the south wall had been switched and were now on the north wall. And the janitor did this. The janitor. And when Amy went to talk to the woman, the janitor, her name was Eustace, this is what Eustace said. Essentially, she said, yes, I did this in some small, perhaps even vain attempt to stimulate the patients who just lay there without any change, without any novelty, without any opportunity for learning and growth. I mean, of course, they're in a coma. I mean, we don't expect miracles. But I just felt that there was something I could do. And then she said the following: I am the most important person in this hospital. Now, I don't know what hospitals are like in Canada, but in the United States, typically the janitor is not the most important person. It may be different in the more socialized healthcare system, but in Texas, that's not the case. She said, Eustace said, I am the most important person in the hospital. And here's why. Because my job is to promote cleanliness. And without cleanliness, there can be no health. Every single person who works in this hospital, the success or failure of their job is predicated on the basic foundation of what I do. To you, it may look like I empty the wastebasket, I mop the floors, but that is absolutely not what I am doing. Day in, day out, I am promoting cleanliness, without which there can be no health. Extraordinary. It is a perfect example of what Amy Wisniewski calls job crafting. And it's very interesting. She uses, and my apologies, the somewhat clunky psychological jargon of cognitive task boundaries. But what a cognitive task boundary essentially is how do you think about the specific tasks of your job? Do you think about them in abstract, broad terms, or do you think about them in extraordinarily specific and concrete terms? So if you were going to go about the business of crafting your job in this one particular way, I would challenge you to answer this question: what do you do for a living? And if you were to ask Eustace, what do you do for a living? She would likely give you the social shorthand, I'm a janitor, but she would likely follow it up with the big picture statement: my job is promoting cleanliness and health at a hospital. When I'm on the airplane and the person next to me asks me, Robert, what do you do for a living? If I do not want to talk to them, I look them straight in the face and I say, I am a psychologist. Their headphones go in. I don't hear from them for the rest of the flight. It's great. If I do want to talk to them, however, I look at them without a hint of irony or embarrassment and I say, why, my job is traveling the world and studying happiness. It's a conversation starter for sure. It's a good one. But I could say any number of things. I collect data. I write manuscripts. I'm interested in cross-cultural differences in affect. But instead, I say I travel the world and study happiness. So if I had to give you a single small challenge to walk out of here today, it would be to do the small first step in storytelling around your job, by crafting your job, by thinking about what it is you do for a living, beyond the title of your specific occupation, beyond sociologist, researcher, consultant, and think broadly about how the more abstract, the broader cognitive task boundary can be imbued with meaning. And to illustrate this, guess what I'm going to do? Tell you a story. Meet Manoj Singh. 34 years old at the time this photo was taken. I know Manoj from Calcutta, India, where I run a charitable project called the Strengths Project. And essentially the same type of strengths-based consultation that my colleagues and I bring into large organizations and we see so effective in that context, we take into the slums of Calcutta. And we believe that if we have cutting-edge technology that works extraordinarily well in organized groups, why should we be withholding it from the people who cannot afford it? So we charge our corporate clients extra, and we use that money to fund the project in Calcutta. And we go and We work with women together in sewing cooperatives and sort of place them into their various positions to essentially do recruitment based on their strengths and all the same things that we would do with international companies. So I was there a few years ago. I go to Calcutta every year, but I was there a few years ago, and I had the opportunity to interview Manoj, which was a little bit unusual because typically the men in the slums are off doing some type of day labor. So it's much easier to interview the women. But on this particular day that this photo was taken, Manoj had a high fever and was homesick. And when I say he was home, this is what I mean. Manoj lives in the Nandabunga slum in South Calcutta. It is an illegal slum settlement. It is not a pretty or desirable or remotely Tony address. They are, as you can see, are ramshackle huts made out of found materials, no mosquito netting, no good tarping or protection from the elements, especially in monsoon season. There are animals, pigs, goats, dogs, cats that relatively run in and out of homes, creating pretty unhygienic conditions. There is no running water. There is no good ventilation in the home for the kerosene stove they own. There are no good latrine facilities. This is not a nice life. To make matters worse, if you start asking people about their job, as I did to Manoj, the story gets more tragic. Manoj is a rickshawala. He is a hand cart puller. Calcutta is one of the last places in the world that actually, it doesn't have, the hip bicycle rickshaws like we're all used to here in the West, where the people actually essentially do the labor of animals, if you will, carting people around. And people who work in this profession have notoriously short lifespans. They tend to die in their 50s. And the working conditions are basically a case study for everything you would not want to have happen at work. Manoj does not own his rickshaw. He has to rent his rickshaw from a landlord. His rickshaw is located 1 hour from where he lives. He has to walk to it. He makes $2 a day, $1 of which has to go for rent. He nets a single dollar a day, except when he misses a day of work, like on this particular day. And then that week, he only gets $6. Oh, but if only that were true. The day after I conducted the interview with Manoj, he went to work feeling a little bit better, and his landlord punished him for not showing up the previous day. This is how he punished them. He knowingly rented Manoj's rickshaw out to somebody else, depriving Manoj of yet a further day's income. This particular week, Manoj made $5. And it is one of the only times, I have done literally more than 1,000 interviews with people in 20 different countries and all sorts of conditions. This is literally one of the only times as a researcher that I simply put my clipboard down. I said, I do not care about 1 to 7 scales in this moment. I just want to know, Manoj, how do you do it? Honestly, I can imagine giving up. How do you motivate yourself? How do you get up every single day and face this? And here's what he said to me. Are you curious? Am I boring you? Okay. He said, Robert, I am the happiest man in the world. That's a quote. I'm the happiest man in the world. I said, how could you possibly say that? That sort of, it defies logic or reason. He said, make no mistake, I'm not a fool. He said, I'm worried all the time. I'm worried about my kids growing up in this poverty. I don't want for them this life. I do have some anger and some sense of disappointment. But those things are overshadowed by my tremendous sense of mission. Tremendous sense of mission. Remind you, this guy is a rickshaw puller. I said, tell me about your mission. And here's what he said. I have these children, these little boys, and they get up with me in the morning. And there's this magical time in Calcutta, just in the advent of sunrise, when the city is still relatively asleep. The blaring honking that is so typical in India hasn't begun for the day. The sweltering heat hasn't reached its peak. Mostly you hear the obnoxious cawing of crows. The city is kind of bathed in a pale light. And he says, my kids get up with me earlier than they have to take breakfast. And sometimes we don't even talk. We just spend this time together, and it is so nice. And we walk off to the edge of the slum, and my kids say goodbye to me there. And I go to work, and I pull the rickshaw all day long. And when I come back, my kids are there every single day. And they always say the same thing. They say, Dad, did you bring us candy? Right? Some things are culturally universal. Did you bring us candy? And he said to me, Robert, you know I can't afford to just be bringing them candy, but the very fact that they have this expectation of me, the very fact that they look to me to provide for them, whether that's candy or food, that's what I think about while I'm pulling the rickshaw. That's my mission. It's extraordinary. Is that enough time? Yeah? Okay. Which brings us to strengths. Strengths, I believe, are the vehicles by which we deliver our life's mission and values. We all believe in a certain set of values, whether that's helping others or personal growth and development. But how we go about the business of our values, I believe, is through the delivery mechanism of our personal strengths. Whether you define those as character strengths or this or that, that's relatively less important to me than the fact that everyone has strengths. Everyone brings strengths to the table. And I don't believe that everyone is equally good at everything. I believe everyone has equal inherent worth, but I think that, in my mind, some people are legitimately more creative than others. Some people are legitimately braver than others, and so forth. It's nice. It's one of the big notions in positive psychology that people ought to work on their strengths a little bit. So let me just give you a tiny bit of theoretical background by way of distinguishing between working on weaknesses and working on strengths. And to do that, I'm not going to tell you a story, but I am going to give you a metaphor. And that metaphor is a sailboat. At first, this is going to seem simplistic, like I'm insulting your intelligence, but trust me, down the line, I'll switch it up, and then you'll think, oh, that kind of was cool. Not a total waste of time. So imagine that you yourself are a sailboat. This is the part I was talking about. Imagine you yourself are a sailboat. And does anyone in here sail? Can I just see? Okay, good. So mostly I'm just talking to the two of you. Welcome. So as the two of you well know, the sailboats are not watertight. All watercraft, basically all vessels, take in a little bit of water. It's just the nature of the business. Water seeps in a little bit. There are, microscopic, imperfections in every boat, regardless of the material from which it is constructed. And let's call those your weaknesses, those imperfections, and that small amount of water sloshing about at the bottom. And when it is very small, you can ignore your weaknesses. Make no mistake, I absolutely recommend this. I recommend this to my own kids. Go ahead and ignore your weaknesses. You heard it here. I'm a doctor. Ignore your weaknesses. If they're very small. If, however, the water starts to accumulate, as it sometimes does, well, then it becomes a bit more critical. And so within organizational context, we would say if you have a business critical weakness, that is one that will start to interfere with your functioning in the workplace, well, then you need to start bailing out that water. You're with me on this, right? This is pretty straightforward. And every once in a while, you find someone that has an enormous gash on the side of their boat, and they need something more radical. They need to be taken out and put in dry dock, and actually, some real work put on them. That's typically when they're sent to the internal coach or whatever. But here's the thing. You should work on your weaknesses to prevent yourself from sinking. But even if you do, even if you are 100% successful, it will propel you, the boat, precisely nowhere. You will not go anywhere. You simply will not sink. You will just bob around in place, stagnating. To go forward, to navigate in your life, you need your sails. And that, I hold out to you, is your strengths. And just like sails have to be regulated based on the wind conditions, strengths have to be regulated based on your professional conditions. You don't just throw up sail willy-nilly hoping that you're going to catch just the right wind and by throwing up your entire sheet. You have to regulate it. Sometimes if it's very windy, you want to put up less sheet. Otherwise, it'll capsize. If it's not very windy, you want to put up more sail. And your strengths are exactly the same way. You can overuse them and absolutely abuse them. I'll give you a quick example of that because it's sometimes a little counterintuitive for people. Worked with an executive one time who was extraordinarily creative. She would walk through the halls of her organization spewing creativity like genius was a dime a dozen. I mean, she would just like pop in on the tech guys and she'd say, it would be so cool if we had this new search engine optimized website. And I think that, if we had a better tracking system for all our stats, wouldn't that be amazing? Here's some ideas for it and some domain names I've been thinking of. And then she'd pat herself on the back and she'd walk out and the tech guys would turn to one another and they'd say, are we supposed to do all that now? And she was horrible to work with. Everyone in her organization complained about her. They could not determine well when she was merely being idly creative and when she was giving an executive order. And so we worked with her a little bit about using creativity more appropriately, using it at an optimal level. She began to institute sort of these creativity Fridays, where the tech guys could drop in if they wanted her advice, and she would have these open brainstorming sessions. And it was great because she legitimately was very creative, so she was a fantastic person to come in and brainstorm with. But you don't want to brainstorm all the time. Sometimes you need to evaluate ideas, sometimes you don't need new ideas, sometimes you need to be working on the old ideas. So it just helped her to be more effective. And I hold even that notion out to you of working on weaknesses as being a completely different process than working on strengths, that they actually are in the service of different end goals, not sinking versus sailing forward, that will help you to create your own narrative structure for what you're going about doing as you seek out professional growth, which is just something that I am assuming that you do seek. One interesting thing I found about strengths is what I call strengths blindness. Strengths blindness is the idea that many people don't recognize their strengths, and there's a very good reason for this. And guess what? To illustrate strengths blindness, I'm going to tell you a very quick story. About a month ago, I interviewed a woman named Laura because I was conducting a study on courage. And she struck me as an extraordinarily courageous person. Here's what happened to Laura about 2 months ago. She and a friend of hers were bicycling in California, in a place not entirely unlike what you see on the screen. And her friend veered off the road, got caught in the gravel, and flew off a cliff. Her friend's feet were clipped in to her pedals, and she fell forward and hit the cliff face and broke a number of bones, was knocked unconscious, and landed face down in a river. This, make no mistake, is a life-threatening event. Here's what Laura did. Laura jumped off the cliff. Just jumped. Landed in the water, drug her friend to safety, saved her friend's life. Saved her friend's life so quickly, so seemingly automatically, that she didn't even realize that in jumping off the cliff, Laura herself broke her ankle and her wrist. And when I said to Laura in the interview, wow, you are so brave, it was like she was hearing that for the first time. The thought literally had never occurred to her. She said, what? I said, you're so brave. She said, I'm not sure where you're coming from with that, Robert. I said, because, the threatening cliff, you saved your friend at some cost to yourself. You took this risk. Any of that ringing a bell to you, Laura? She had strength blindness. She said, that's what anyone would have done. Fundamentally not true. Let's review. Some people would have just screamed, ah! Some people would have tried to flag down a motorist for help. Some people would have carefully tried to climb down the cliff. Even as I start saying these other options, you see that even more are available, that it is clearly not what everyone would do. But she did this, even at some personal cost to herself. But it seemed so natural to her. And often our strengths are so second nature to us, so natural to us, that we forget that they're extraordinary. We come to believe that they're ordinary. But make no mistake, your strengths are extraordinary. You just sometimes are blind to it. And I think that could be an interesting narrative vehicle for you as you consider the story of your own work. So at the Center of Applied Positive Psychology, the UK-based consultancy with which I work, we are interested in the story of the organization as a strengths-based organization. So I'm just going to make a business case study. We work with Aviva, the largest insurance company in the UK. They have 60,000 employees. And Aviva is really adopted the strengths approach, and they want a cradle-to-grave strengths culture. That means they want strengths recruitment, strengths placement, strengths-based performance management. They want strengths-based outplacement programs if they have to let people go. They want strengths across the board. So they asked us, can you run a strengths-based recruitment strategy for us? And we said, absolutely. What department do you want? They said, we need to take on a bunch of people in the call center, for the insurance claims call center. I said, great, that's a great place to start. So we ran this advert. And I'll just, kind of sum up what it says about Joe here on the left. Joe is the listener. We just identified various strengths that people who would flourish in the call center might have. Now, mind you, we didn't take a competency-based approach. We didn't say, do you have 3 years or more of experience working in call centers? Do you understand call center telephonics? Tell us what computer programs you know. None of that stuff. You know why? Because that stuff can be taught. Basically, people are smart enough at the very least. They can learn how to use Excel if they don't know how to use it already. What we asked instead is the stuff that's much harder to teach, the fundamental strengths. We said, meet Joe. In the world of insurance claims, Joe is the listener. When the phone rings, Joe comes to life. She loves hearing people's stories, and better yet, she knows exactly what to do with the information. In the world of insurance claims, Joe is the listener. Are you like Joe? Here was the result. We had a very small applicant pool. The people who applied for the job were of a considerably higher caliber than typically applied to these types of positions. What did this mean? It means that it was already a huge upfront cost savings for Aviva because Aviva was able to interview fewer people. And the people they got were great. It also meant that they were able to shorten their induction and training process by a week. they cut turnover in half. Let me say that one again. They cut turnover in half based on people who are recruited into the organization from this strengths-based method. But make no mistake, the strengths-based method, this type of interview technique is a professional promissory note. You cannot bring people into your organization on the promise that they will be managed based on strengths and then never mention strengths again. You legitimately have to have a strengths-based culture where managers are placing you based on strengths, looking at your strengths. And if there is any type of disconnect between the entry interview and placement, people will leave, and they'll leave pretty quickly. But what Aviva has done, remarkably, is created this narrative trajectory for themselves. They've said, we are a place that values strengths. We value you as an individual. We want to know what you bring to the table. And we want to give you the opportunity to do it. Sure, we're going to tell you what to do, but we want to give you the autonomy to think how to do it yourself. We say what, you say how. And people seem to like it. It seems to work. It seems to be a story that resonates with people. I think you can probably tell, but I absolutely love stories. I believe stories are how we try out new identities, how we communicate our values to others. I believe that stories are how we come to know ourselves, how we entertain, how we bring intimacy about, how we deal with problems. It's absolutely wonderful. Stories are so powerful. And in fact, that's the other part, that stories are told to an audience. And you have to have the audience in mind. Your professional strength story or your work-related story is good for you because you get to be an author of it. That means you get to edit it how you see fit. You get to do all that nice narrative approach. But the actual act of the story happens in the telling. And for that, you need to think about the audience. You need to keep the audience in mind. What might the audience get out of this? What might the audience be interested in? So just to illustrate this point, and this is actually my very last point, I'm going to finish with my own strength story at work. And I want you not just to listen to the story, which will be somewhat entertaining, but I want you to actually see how it feels to listen to someone's story, their strength story, and see what type of effect it has on you, cognitively, emotionally, professionally. Ready? Developing one's strength story is a bit like approaching a blank canvas. And you tell the story over and over and over, and it's in the retelling, in the paring down of the unnecessary parts, that you streamline the story and get it nice and tight. So what I'm going to offer you is a story that I have told literally dozens of times, so that it is the complete package. One of my first jobs out of graduate school was studying the happiness of the Maasai tribal people in Kenya. Are you familiar with the Maasai? Okay. For those who are not, the Maasai are sort of the poster children for tribal Africa. They are visually a very striking people. They live off in the savannah, in the bush, with wild animals all around, a pretty inhospitable environment. They tend to be very skinny and tall. They swaddle themselves in these bright red cloaks, shuka they're called. They elongate their earlobes. The young warriors put ochre paste in their hair and have long braids. They carry tall spears. They live far off the grid, far outside the world economy. And I was dying to go see whether they were happy or not. So I jumped in my Jeep. I drove across the just brilliant, lush Great Rift Valley. And I don't know if any of you have ever done that before, but it's a sublime experience, where here a deer might dart in front of your car. There, literally, 2 giraffes went in front of my car. I was like, WTF, giraffes? Really? That's so cool. And I pulled up into the Minyata, the village, And I jumped out of my car with my clipboard, and I said, okay, on a 1 to 7 scale, how satisfied are you guys with every domain of your life? And the Maasai did not care at all. They said, we're not interested in your research. And I said, no, but this is going to be in a peer-reviewed journal. They could not have cared less. So they started asking me questions. They said, Robert, how are you at herding cattle? Admittedly, I'm a bit rusty, I had to say. They said, do you think that if a mongoose was stealing our chicken eggs, you would be able to spot it and kill it? Mongoose? All I know is a mongoose is not technically a goose. Beyond that, I could not identify it. They said, would you be able to spot a wild animal as it snuck towards the village? On this last point, I guarantee you I cannot, because it happened. I was sitting on these small stools with these 2 Maasai guys one day, and both of them stopped. They were like, ch-ch. And they looked off into the distance. And I just thought, great. This is the part where the white guy gets eaten. And the grass is only this tall. So it had to be like a mini lion, like this big. I mean, what could it possibly have been out there? But they were intently focused on some danger out in the grass. And suddenly they jumped up. So I jumped up, right? I'm with them. If they're going to jump up, I think it's probably prudent to copy. And then they jumped out of the way, both directions. Pew! And, they're known for jumping. They're great jumpers, right? So they leap out of the way just in time for me to go, ah! I look down, and right next to my leg, there is a cobra. Now, I don't know if you guys know about cobras. In my memory, it must have been 70 feet long? It's about this big around, jet black. So I stand there and scream. They jump out of the way, and then they ran, and they just killed it. These guys are tough, right? And in fact, one of the things I noticed about them is that they truly are very tough. If there is a single defining characteristic for the Maasai that describes their culture better than any other, if they had a collective character strength, it would be courage. These are courageous people. They live in an extraordinarily inhospitable environment. Cheetahs, leopards, Cape buffalo, hippos, elephants. Anyone here ever been killed by any of those? No? The Maasai sometimes are. The women will go out in the morning to collect firewood, and one of them won't come back because she was trampled by a Cape buffalo. I don't know what your morning commute is like, but it is rough over there. And they burn themselves on their arms and legs. You just see these scars all over, just for no other reason than just to show they can take it. I mean, these are a tough, tough people. The young Morani, the warriors, they after their circumcision, and they do practice circumcision, but after this period of healing, following roughly their 15th birthday, they join the warriorhood, sort of a roving National Guard, and they go out together and not ritually, but they go out together and they kill a lion, just with their spears and swords. I don't know, again, if anyone here has done any lion killing, but it sounds really tough to me, really courageous to go face down a lion with nothing in your hand but a sword. I saw a point of entry into their culture. Remember, I was there to do research, and I saw a way that I could gain their respect. I saw a way to connect with them that I believed would lead to my research success. It just so happens I am extraordinarily courageous. Let me say that again without a hint of embarrassment. I am braver than most people. I don't think I'm better than other people because of it. It's just the cards I was given. I'm not as generous as other people. I'm certainly not as forgiving as other people. I may not be as creative as other people. Other people, even here in this room, all sorts of wonderful strengths I don't have. Courage just happens to be what was dealt out to me. I know I'm breaking a social norm by standing up here and claiming my own strength in front of you, but please understand, I do not think that I'm better than you. I know in your hearts, most of you are like, Americans. They just got it. So I turned to the Maasai and I said, let's go kill a lion together. And they looked at me and they said, Mzungu, white guy, absolutely not. The lion will take one look at you, recognize you are the weakest among us, and it is you he will kill. Circumcision was out. So I said, why don't you guys take me off into the bush and burn me? And they said, okay. We've been dying for a chance to burn an American. Sounds awesome. So we walked off into the bush, and this young warrior, Lankasana, he got this grass fire going, and he put this stick about as thick as your finger. So take a look at your finger and imagine the end of it being glowing orange, hot coal. He's getting it hot inside this fire. And while we're waiting for the stick to get truly painfully hot, my translator said to me, Robert, you have to understand what you're doing here. I said, no, I think I got it. Pretty straightforward. Burn me, done. He said, no. If you act cowardly, no one in Maasai land will have anything to do with you. I said, describe cowardly. He said, Robert, if when they burn you, you have your arms folded like this, if you were to do this, that would be an act of unspeakable cowardice. They have a pretty high threshold for bravery. I said, okay, I think I got it. And I unbuttoned my shirt. Lankasana came over, this big, thick stick, glowing hot coal at the end. And he pressed it into my chest. This is a true story. He pressed it into my chest. Has anyone here ever been burned by the Maasai before? Yeah, they did not teach me this in research methods, I'll tell you that. It kills. It hurts so badly. It hurts literally like it is its own metaphor. It hurts like getting burned by the Maasai. I mean, next time you hit your hammer or your thumb with a hammer, you should say, ow, that hurts like getting burned by the Maasai. It is the metaphor, it hurts so much. It killed. But my translator turned to me and he said, Robert, you did so well. Now only 8 more to go. Always read the fine print. It turns out to get a really good scar, the type that the Maasai really love, you have to burn the same place 3 separate times. And they wanted to burn me in 3 separate places. 3 times 3 is 9. So 1 down, 8 more to go. And they put that stick back on that same spot again, and it hurt, if anything, worse than the first time around. I will tell you, just as an interesting aside, I was once interviewed by a student newspaper at an American university, and they either didn't understand what I was doing for a living or what, but their story, and I absolutely loved the story, they printed this article that said, Biswas Diener collects data from the Messiah. Yes, we had an N of 1, but everything was significant. That's a science joke. Here is the result of me seizing upon an opportunity to do what I do best. My response rate after that was 100% for my research. Everywhere I drove, even to the distant Miniatas, the people would come running out. Word had spread. I was like a local celebrity. They said, can we participate in your study? We would love to talk to you. And they submitted to doing 2 hours of interviewing across 2 days, so 4 hours per person. I got 135 traditional Messiah living outside of the world economy to submit to 4 hours of interviews with me. I stayed there for months working with them. And I attribute it to that defining moment, to my ability to recognize that I was good at something and to seize upon it and leverage it. Technically, is everything in that story true? Well, yes, the parts that are important, I got burned by the Messiah, but it's also a construction. It's also what I make of it. This is a story I have crafted about myself and about my job over years. And I would suggest to you that you have the same opportunity. So as I send you out into the rest of your week, I would send today to you, create your own story and tell it to people. Actually tell it to people, because this story only got to be like this in the telling. It wasn't just that I do really cool stuff. It's that I told the story over and over and over, which is why it seems so well crafted. And yours doesn't have to be dramatic. You don't have to go out and get burned by anybody. But just tell it over and over and over, and leave out the parts that don't work or that you don't like. Leave in the parts that are meaningful, the parts that are useful, and most of all, the parts that will inspire others. Because typically when we talk about our strengths and we tell our strength stories, that is the result. People don't think, awful Americans. Not really. They think, wow, it's kind of cool to see someone at their best. Finished. Do I have time for questions? I don't know.
Robert, I know that you've been collecting stories about courage, and I just wanted to know if you've gotten, if you could tell us about where you are with that project of collecting stories about courage.
Sure. I'm writing a book on courage right now. So I've been doing these interviews and interviewing everyone from people who jump out of airplanes to entrepreneurs that are willing to start a business in a down economy, to people who've done heroic deeds, to people like Sarah Otten, who set multiple world records when she rowed a boat across the Indian Ocean in her 20s. People who do both outlandishly brave things and very mundane brave things, like get on an airplane even though they're afraid of flying. So I'm looking to capture sort of the full spectrum of courage, and it's as a story aficionado, I absolutely love the project, but I'm writing it up into a book essentially because I'm interested in some of these concepts like courage blindness. That a lot of courageous people don't recognize what they do as being courageous, and I think that's interesting. Or the fact, and this comes from the research, that getting angry helps you to be more courageous. It helps you step through fear. I just interviewed a soldier who recently returned from Baghdad, and I said, how do you kick in doors and step through it knowing you could be shot? And he said, I'd never give it a second thought. I'm just so angry. And I mean, obviously, that's not how we want the world to run, but I do think there is something pretty extraordinary about the ability to face a danger like that. So that's what I'm up to. Yeah.
Are they mutually exclusive?
He asked, is being a workaholic and having a calling mutually exclusive? From an empirical point of view, I have no idea. Logic would tell me, might some people in a calling also be workaholics? Theoretically, that would seem possible. So how do we extricate those two constructs from one another? And I think a good rule of thumb would be, is your work interfering with the other areas of your life? Are you putting your family on the back burner because you're working, even though you feel your work is so meaningful? And certainly I believe there are people in a calling orientation who are not, who do have what we would think of as work-life balance, even though they have this extraordinary sense of